Welcome to Heaven's Edge. Platform of nutrient exchange is appropriate for your life form.
An ale, I guess?
Sympathizing ale?
Alright, thanks. Let's try it. It's actually pretty good.
Attention Spacers, welcome back to another thrilling episode of Adventures in the Void. We are a sci-fi tabletop role-playing game discussion transmission. I am Jake.
And I'm Ross.
Join us as we trade tales and celebrate the beauty and wonder of the cosmos.
Welcome back to the Adventures in the Void Spacecast. Here at the Spacecast, we talk about indie and classic sci-fi tabletop RPGs. My name is Ross McClure. I'm joined once again by my friend Father Chris.
Good evening again. Always a pleasure to talk about this subject.
Yeah, so last time we talked about Traveler, like what is Traveler, and let's crack it open. Let's look at Traveler. One thing we talked about last time was Traveler. There are all these different editions. Do we mean Mongoose? Do we mean there are the indie versions like Cepheus? And I think somewhat the conclusion we came to is if it resembles Traveler, it's Traveler, right? Like classic Traveler, Cepheus, Mongoose First Edition, Second Edition. That's all Traveler, right?
Yeah. It's one of the main charms of it.
Yeah, and I think that's true of, Mongoose Second Edition and Classic Traveler, just as a spectrum. They have a lot in common. So, but I can't speak for systems that really did something different, like GURPS or the D20 version or anything like that. And I don't have any experience with them, so.
No, and neither do I, but I find it's interesting that there's some things to dispute, but the things that Traveler people talk about are common amongst all of the core editions. Sometimes there's disputes, and people will talk in their own separate forums, Mongoose or Cepheus, the missile damage differences between editions and things like that. But when you're talking about something like the way the universe works or something like that, people can talk across editions for a while before they have to start getting specific.
Yeah. So I think that's, like you said, that's part of what's really great about it is I think we can fairly say Traveler, and that can't be said in our other big hobby that you and I have, which is Dungeons and Dragons. You can't say that about classic versus modern D&D. They're very different, essentially two different games. But okay, so Traveler, the role-playing game, whatever your flavor of it is, what are the things that you can do? Like what is the genre scope? I mean, it's science fiction role-playing, but what are all the things that a person might do with characters and stories and events and adventures? What would they look like in Traveler? The scope of it.
Well, the scope is as far as your spaceship can travel. And I suppose it could also be defined technologically.
Okay.
So, as you know, Traveler has tech levels, and they range from 0 to 16. That's sort of the range that a traveler is somewhat likely to encounter, and as you get near the extremes of that range, you're far less likely to encounter it.
Okay. What is tech level 0, 8, and 16? What would you find at those three?
So, with the caveat that there may be some differences in description between editions, in general, I can say tech level 0 is going to be Stone Age up to Iron Age, approximately.
Okay.
Very approximately. 8 is going to be something just past current Earth technology with like the current prototypes and theoretical models that predict what's going to be invented in the next 50 years. That would be 8.
Okay.
And 16 would be I would say like Star Wars. A lot of Star Wars technology would fall within tech level 16. You know,
Like what? Yeah.
the ability to have a plasma weapon that is restricted in range and able to be extended and retracted and powered within an item that can fit on your belt.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
That would be, I would argue, that's something that would fall under tech level 16. Being able to sort of hop across the galaxy in what would appear to be hours, at the most days. That's way faster than anything expressed in most of Traveler. Actually, that's actually beyond tech level 16 in Traveler, because tech level 16 means jump 6 is regular. Jump 6 is like what they can generally produce in a lot of their vessels.
And just as a reminder, you can go 1 parsec per jump, which is, what is that? Like, how many light years? 3.5 light years or something like that? I can't remember.
I think it's 3.2 light years is a parsec, and that's 1 hex on the Traveler map. And so jump 6 will get you across 6 of those in 1 jump. And 6 times 3.2 is 20, I guess. 20 something? 22? Something like that.
Yeah.
So that's 22 light year, 20-some light years is the maximum that a ship can jump in 1 jump. And our galaxy is a couple 100,000 light years across, I think. Something like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's like 100,000 light years across
Okay.
or maybe that's the known galaxy or whatever. But yeah, yeah, a lot of science fiction. You know, you could warp 500 light years, 1,000 light years. You know, so you cross the galaxy.
Star Trek. Yeah, Star Trek deals in quadrants.
Yeah.
The galaxy is divided into quadrants, and we, like, in 24th century Star Trek, we know we've seen pretty much all of the Alpha Quadrant. And, you know, Deep Space Nine has a wormhole that opens into the Delta Quadrant, I think it is. I can't remember. Maybe I'm getting them mixed up. And then in Voyager, they get shot across the galaxy into the, maybe it's Gamma, Delta, I forget. I'm mixing them up. The Beta Quadrant, something like that. The point is, Deep Space Nine and Voyager are about 2 entirely different quadrants, and they lead to unexplored places with their own stuff. Like, Traveler occupies an area of space that would be like less than 1/10 of one of the quadrants in Star Trek.
Okay, so it sounds like part of the scope of Traveler then is technology that's not so high that it reaches a point of bordering on fantasy, like where it's like Star Trek has these things that it's so far beyond us that the show doesn't even try to explain it anymore, or it can make up terms for things. Like, it sounds like maybe Traveler is a little more grounded than, you know, Star Trek.
I mean, and the question is the kind of question that begs that would seem to I don't know, ask for an epic response. Like, what's the scope of Traveler? What can you do? I mean,
Yeah.
but the truth is, the scope of Traveler is almost defined by its groundedness, and so it means that within that, just to take for example our own game, but that we just got through playing a session of, both in and out of character, I would have liked to have been shut of this planet a long time ago. I really hate it here, and we've been here for multiple sessions. I'm not saying I hate the game. I've tied my character is very much tied into my knowledge of Traveler, and that sort of defines the character amongst the group that he's part of. He's a former merchant, and he knows about how the galaxy map works and has a general idea of where home is, and he'd like to go back there. And that defines his motivation. Within that sets the mental landscape, right? Here we are stuck in this backwater called the Bowman Arm, which is sort of sitting nestled between two little slices of the Imperium. And so the scope is, and now this is going to sound epic, it's actually multiple layers of infinity, if you will, or
Yeah.
virtual infinity in terms of gaming life. Because you have this layer where your character exists knowing that there's all these worlds that they could go to, but so often, because of the vicissitudes of life as a traveler, you get tied down, you get stabbed in the back, we've been on this one godforsaken rock for several weeks in time, in game, or at least a couple weeks in game, and out of game several, a month and a half or so of sessions at this point.
Yeah.
And it's all been good stuff, and there's always more to do. There's a slaver camp to to raid. There's a space Viking political plot to unravel, and it's all on one planet, and it'll be more when we get to where we're trying to go, and also every spot in between as we're trying to get there. And so the scope is
so at the point where probably you could bypass that is where the scope ends, because at that point you're not a traveler anymore.
You mean when it doesn't matter?
Yeah, like at a certain point, if you have the technology to simply bypass space travel to a point where it doesn't matter very much.
Many traveler games do end on that. I've seen more than one that I've played in actually end with the discovery of some sort of MacGuffin technology that advances things to the point where it sort of brings a meaningful end to the campaign for those characters.
Okay. All right, so that's kind of the range then. So it sounds like at least the mechanics we have for it, what we do in it, which is traveling. We're constrained by these jump distances and the jump drive technology.
The word relatable keeps popping into my head.
Yeah.
I think it's actually really important for Traveler. It's not a game about how crazy alien things are. It's a game about how workaday this science fiction galaxy is.
Yeah, I love what Mark Miller says in the back of the book. Like this warrants. Can I quote Mark Miller? Can I do? Can I do
I sure hope so.
Let's see here. This was really good. A final word. This is like one of my favorite chapters in the book. He says that the typical methods used in life on 20th century Terra, or 20th century Terrans, were not 20th century Terrans though, so that's interesting. By the typical methods of life used by 20th century Terrans, which he says are thrift and dedication and hard work, they will not work for travelers. Instead, travelers must boldly plan and execute daring schemes for the acquisition of wealth and power. And so it is like, it seems to me that it rests on this bedrock of you're just this person in space with a job trying to get by, but trying to just do your job and keep your head down is never going to work out for you. You're ultimately going to have to do something crazy, which makes it also kind of adventure as far as it's like it's genre. It's like a space adventure thing too.
Space adventure. I mean, I suppose that's really the scope. That's probably the better answer to the scope question. Is the scope is classic space adventure, and that's not really about mind-blowing otherness.
Right.
And that distinguishes it from certain kinds of sci-fi. So it doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily lend itself to that. It's not that you can't include it, of course, but the core machinery of it isn't based on that.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. That gives me kind of an idea. And actually, this is like this helps me kind of put it in perspective. This idea that you are a regular person, but on top of that, to be a regular person that operates a starship, you're going to have to do extraordinary things, and you're going to do that to get power and wealth. And that actually sort of makes a lot of things in my mind click. So at the same time, this also isn't like like a coffee shop simulator. Like you're not gonna, and there are actually a couple RPGs like that. I can't remember the name of it, but there's one that I think of where like you're just a person role playing on a ship, like and that's it. There's that sort of adventure from sci-fi pulp is not present, and that's not the goal of that role playing.
Well, this brings us into a bit of the edition discussion, actually, because as Traveler progressed, and it didn't take Mongoose to do this. Mark Miller himself did this, and the other people behind the earlier editions began bringing different ways into play. Because actually, I don't know why. I don't want to. I don't know all the whys and wherefores.
Sure. Yeah, why they did it, but yeah.
But I know why I would have done it if I was them, and I know why I like it.
Well, actually, I could speak to that because I heard an interview with him. A lot of that was a lot of the initial change. They had like an idea of the game. I remember this. I listened to an interview. They had an initial idea of the game, and they liked the game themselves. They played the game. They were playing the game they played. And at that university, and their friends, if I recall correctly, they loved simulations, and they loved these kind of, here's a game where you're like Mexican drug cartels and you're competing with one another. Here's this game where you're, 18th century Western European generals that all have personalities, and they would have these really in-depth. It's hard to just call them war games. They were very simulationist war games.
Yeah.
And this was a simulationist science fiction game, and what happened is when it got released out into the wild, people actually loved it, but it was a wider audience that loved it, and they demanded things. They wanted adventure paths, they wanted context, they wanted a setting, they wanted tools, and they found themselves putting out a lot of things that sort of changed the direction of the game.
Right. And as much as I love, and I mean love, Classic Traveler, I mean, I knew I would love it. There was never a doubt in my mind, and now that I'm playing it, I love it. I am glad for the additions of some of the different careers and later additions in the little, I guess they just would release, splat books with entertainer or whatever, all the different ones, not entertainer, but
I think you're right.
That is one of them.
But they had mercenary and belter and
right. And so, one of the reasons that I think Mongoose is so good, and I know this is, obviously, it's about indie games, but it's because it really encapsulates all of all of previous Traveler editions.
Yeah, no, it's great.
But when you're talking about like what kind of what you can do in it, what the scope of it is, it's actually very unlikely for a player to roll a ship. I mean, when I say not extremely unlikely, but I'd say there's less than half chance, less than 50% chance that a party will end up with a ship. And if you don't have a ship, well, then it's not a different game, but all of a sudden all your motivations or your motivation might be to get a ship. But then it's like, okay, you hire yourself out as crew hands, or what do? You just look for work on one planet? I mean, if anything, our game has shown that there's more than enough content on just one planet, potentially. Right. So, which is another glory of the game, and it's certainly part of the tropes. I mean, that's like Philip K. Dick wrote dozens of short stories, many of which are very small, contained scenarios, but he always hints at things happening in a wider galaxy and stuff like that. So that's certainly part of the tradition, to tell those kinds of stories. I remember the Blade Runner movie sort of refers to that. It's based on one of his novels. When you have all these big advertisements saying, come to the colony, the off-world life, start anew in the off-world colonies, and the story's not about any of those people. It's about the people. It's about the people that will never make it off-world. They're not allowed to because they don't, like, their genetics don't qualify.
Yeah. So you
that's the story you could tell in Traveler, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I know that's for. And this is one of those things that I think to modern ears, at least from the perspective of people playing the big brand and game, maybe this won't sound good, but it was a hoot, and I loved it. I rolled a Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition character in my second time playing, and we were traveling. I don't know. We went to investigate we had a job to investigate some kind of alien facility on a area that was supposed to be owned by this corporation, and it didn't go well, and we barely made it out because they apparently had planet launchable missiles, which I guess is this is either wasn't a red zone or it was becoming one or whatever, and I rolled someone who did not get in the military, did not get into college, did not have a job, and was literally a homeless, like a vagrant. I can't remember the name of the job, but it's
Drifter.
I was a drifter, and I could not get out of being a drifter, and I stayed a drifter for 3 terms straight and started the game with no skills as a drifter with 2,000 credits.
Well, you would have had to have at least gotten you some basic training skills or something.
Yeah, from the skill package or whatever. But I was and I just say that to say that you can have that, and on the opposite end, you could have like an admiral with his own ship, with and weapons and 150,000 credits and no debt. Or you can start the game with a bunch of debt. And I actually love that about Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition, is that it really represents this, like, you are a person in space. And it could be anything in between. You could be this mighty noble lord, or this person that is literally in the alleyways of a high port, among the trash and the refuse, trying to dumpster dive and get by, and literally everything in between is possible. So yeah, it seems like you could have all of those stories, and you could have stories of people that are daring starfarers, or you could have people that are starfarers but they're just barely scraping by, or you can have tell me what you think about this, but you could have, and it seems to me like this system, Classic Traveler or Modern or whatever, I think all of them could do a really banger military science fiction campaign. where you're either like, Imperial Marines or, actually on the like deck officers of a fleet. I wondered if it. Let me ask you this, actually. Well, first of all, what do you think
Well,
about like those options? And
yeah,
I
well,
got one that I've thought about, and I wonder if it would be good at it. But
I mean, I think any of the science fiction that is grounded, I mean, it can do.
yeah,
It's that's I mean, I think relatability remains the key.
Yeah.
It's the default mode of the game does not push you even towards playing an alien, although it's very possible. But the default mode is to play one of the different, it assumes human, very much so.
right.
And maybe that's a bit of a tangent, but I mean, I had the first Traveler game I ran, one of the characters ended up being, getting a double promotion like twice in his career. In other words, which is actually technically you're not supposed to do that, but I always let it happen because I feel like it's so unlikely to happen. Then
Right.
I like the stories that could emerge from it. And he ended up being I think he had a social of 14 or 15 or something crazy by the end of it, and was also an admiral. And so I was like, well, you're just the hero of the Rim then. You're the hero of this of the your actions in combat won the war, against the Soleimani.
That's kind of the wild thing about the modern Traveler Second Edition is that you can have in the same game someone who is 19 years old and spent their. It's maybe worth actually diving into the elements of Traveler here since we're talking about it. So
Yeah, a little bit.
So character creation. This could be its own whole topic, but very broadly speaking, how does it work in Traveler?
And we touched on it a little bit last time. It works a lot the same. At least it starts a lot the same, which is you just roll. You roll for your stats.
Yeah, you got 6 stats, and they look familiar: strength, dexterity, and then they're a little bit different, but they're familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, and the roll is a roll of 2d6 for each stat, and then you begin. You choose your origin planet. This is handled in different ways in different editions, and some editions have more than one method. And your referee may offer you a choice of origin planets according to his setting, or really what it is you're choosing your absolute base starting skill set. It's the things that you're assumed to have learned when you were being raised on whatever planet you come from. I think every version of Traveler has this in some way.
Yeah.
And then you are 18 years old, at which point you decide, are you going to college or are you going straight into a career? And you then begin rolling. I don't remember if Classic Traveler has a college option in character creation. I know it has one in play, but it's one that takes your character out of play for the length of time that he's in college. So I guess they just decided to incorporate it as a character creation option because it makes sense to do so. But it's definitely in Mongoose. And at this point, starting at 18, you begin to serve 4-year terms. Whether it's a 4-year term of college or it's a 4-year term of, you try to roll, you roll 2d6 to try to get into a career, to qualify for it. After which, make some rolls to see what happens during that 4-year term. And then at the end of it, you make a survival roll. You make a survival roll. In the original Classic Traveler, the survival roll was just that. If you failed it, you're dead.
Yeah, and there it is, the big infamous thing that people are like, I'm not even going to touch that game. You can die in character creation. What these people just love death and pain. Like, well, what is wrong with these psychopaths? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not like it's a game of diplomacy. You don't have to go home when you get knocked out, you can just start
Yeah.
rolling again, and you know, it's part of the fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's in the later editions that was softened somewhat. Another feature of Classic Traveler is when your first career ends, that's the end of character creation. I don't believe there's a provision to change careers during character creation in Classic Traveler. Which overall, and also because of how deadly it is every time you have to roll a survival roll, people don't tend to push the terms and you know, start with older and more skilled characters. So generally, your characters in Classic Traveler are going to be younger. They're going to have fewer skills overall, and life is just going to be generally harder for them.
Yeah.
In Mongoose Traveler, it's not automatically deadly. The only way to die in character creation would be as if you chose to, basically. Literally that, because you can, at any time, you can choose to have your wounds taken care of, but then you can incur medical debt, which you'll start the game with.
And that's another one of those things that I've heard some Traveler referees be like, "Oh, I would never do that. I have medical debt in real life. I would never want to do that to somebody in a fictional world." But of course, we talked about that last time. How you used the term familiarity tonight, but last time we talked, you know,
relatability. Yeah.
Or sorry, relatability. Yeah, but and last time we talked about how it was based in the physical world, like that it had a realism to it, and that was key. And so we keep running into these things as we talk about it. Like, yeah, you could die in character creation. You could have medical debt on the get-go. You might start with nothing but a prison term and then be thrown out on your butt with no money. It's really, these things are possible, and really part of the fun, because like you have the opportunity to be a part of this science fiction world instead of creating a science fiction world. You can be a part of this implied world, and you don't know what's going to happen, and you got to kind of roll with that. I love that, anyways.
Oh, I mean, it's huge. The things that can happen in character creation are, I think, more amusing as the editions progress. because the makers of the game began to realize how much fun everybody was having.
Yeah, it's
with the character
Mongoose Second Edition is so great in that, you know, you can have life events and you can tie those in. Now, I think, to me, the thing to do in Classic Traveler is to just do that anyway.
Sure.
And that could be said of a lot of things, because Classic Traveler relies more on an open system where a lot of these things aren't clearly defined. Whereas in Mongoose Traveler Second Edition, it tells you word for word what to do and what you can do. And that's the difference between classic and modern. But I think these things are simply not written in Classic Traveler. But what I'm hearing you describe for character creation is a game. This is a game.
Yeah,
this is not. Let's just get this over with, or you know. It's like, no, this is a game. Hypothetically, if you added a couple elements to it, you could just stop here. You could have a game you could play.
There are many people that do just that. There are, you can look it up. Speaking of indie games, there's a game called Solo, which is made. It started off as, I think they marketed it as Space Trader or Star Trader or something like that. You can find this on Drive-Thru-RPG. And then they made it into its own whole solo method of playing Traveler, essentially. It's something you could have come up with on your own. It just requires a familiarity with Traveler rules and a bit of an imagination to push things in a certain directions or whatever. But I've spent many an evening by myself or with friends just creating Traveler characters that sometimes I would retain and use as NPCs in later games, and sometimes it would be for the game we were planning on playing. But either way, it was just, you know, it's definitely not a drag. Traveler character creation is, to me, it's never a drag.
Yeah,
but
no,
I mean, another feature of it though, speaking of that, is we've mentioned 4-year terms. In Classic Traveler, it still tends to result in characters that are going to be, in their mid to late 20s, maybe early 30s. But in Mongoose Traveler, you can end up with characters that are like scientist characters that are in their 70s.
Right.
And and they're essentially the Traveler version of like a wizard in his tower, because oftentimes they'll end up with a lab ship. And you can center a campaign just around a character that happened to roll an awesome scientist with a lab ship, and all sorts of interesting possibilities around that. Playing characters at different places in their lives than I think most role players are used to playing. Most people play a certain predictable kinds of arcs. I'm among them. There's nothing like it. It's awesome, but.
Right.
Traveler provides a whole different experience when you realize that, as my character has, that in the game that you're the Classic Traveler game we're in, he's the oldest character, I think, by 4 to 8 years than everybody else, and it's an interesting thing that settled in my brain. It's like, that's big, that's a big deal if you're just playing in a game where the game is based on your familiarity and comfort level with the tropes that you're slinging around, and when you imagine the room that you're in, and you realize your character's sitting there, we go back to Han Solo, he's in his mid-30s and Luke is 17, right? So that's very much a scenario that unfolds in Traveler, where you've got these people who, in some cases, they might be completely washed up on their last legs. In other cases, they might feel themselves to, even though they might have finished a 20-year career, for them, maybe now their life is really starting. And for somebody else, it's like the last chance they'll ever have.
And for some, they have no other choices. Like all of these different motivations, it can be completely different. Yeah. I do feel like Classic Traveler, to make a distinction there, to me is based. It has a connection to military science fiction, and to maybe to the author's experiences. In that a lot of people that did have a lot of skills, this is true, if you had a lot of interesting technical skills, or you are a pilot or an explorer or something like that back in the 70s, you probably came out of the military, and
a radar operator.
Exactly. So like
commo guy.
Probably the government, Uncle Sam taught you how to do that stuff, and it says here, career types. There are 6 career types generated that are general careers assumed to exist across human societies within the galaxy. And really, there's only 2 options. There's military and you failed, because if you take other, you don't get any. There are no. Let me see here. Here it is. There's no ranks. There are skills, but they are not as good, in my opinion, or they're very basic. And just the loss of ranks is huge, because ranks determine your cash payouts and your benefit payouts and stuff. So like now it all
and what that means, by the way, is that's what happens at the end of character creation, is you get your retirement benefits.
And he keeps it kind of generalized, but he says, covers some trades. It says ne'er-do-wells and the shady realm of the underworld. So to me, if somebody rolls up other, and that's why I have everybody just start out as like you're in the military and that's your inciting event, because to me that makes sense. Like, these are people that came out of space Vietnam, and now they're never going to actually get to come home again. They're never going to fit in, and these skills prepare them for things they can do, but they also set them apart where they're never going to get to actually fit in. That's kind of how I view Classic Traveler. Now, that's from the original text, obviously, but Classic Traveler, as you noted, has the splat books, and they added on Belter and Mercenary and all kinds of stuff, Merchant Prince, all kinds of stuff later.
Yeah. Now you were talking about different types of sci-fi it could emulate, and you said you had one and you wanted to ask about it. Did we already cover that?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, can it do Top Gun? Can it do Top Gun in space? When I think I think about like X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, or X-Wing, or I think about Wing Commander. Those are sci-fi games that were huge for me as a kid. Can you be a scrappy leather jacket wearing Imperial pilot on a flight deck in the Imperial Navy, and does it have a dogfighting minigame? Can you dogfight? I know one does, but I don't know about the other. But anyways, I'm interested in your perspective, because I actually thought about this. I was like, man, it would be really cool. What is that tabletop game? Is it Aces High? There is a tabletop game that is like a little war game simulator of like being a fighter pilot, and I can't remember what it is. But
there's actually a Star Wars one.
Yeah, I love that one. I have it up here. X-Wing. I love it. So like, could you play X-Wing and Traveler, or something like that? So,
and this is a bit of a guilty secret. I don't know. The actual mechanics of the space combat of Traveler is the thing that I'm least good at. As far as my knowledge, my impression is that you could. It would just require doing the kind of tracking that I'm not a huge fan of doing as a GM myself.
Yeah.
So I haven't touched too much upon the multiple ship thing. I've done a little bit of it, but I find, especially if there's missiles involved, and you have competent gunners, that these types of encounters can be over pretty quickly. And it doesn't but I've also honestly never run one with small craft. And in Traveler they make a distinction. You've got small craft, which is what fighters would be. Shuttle-sized things, or explicitly fighters. And they're distinguished by the fact that they don't have jump drives. And other than that, though, they can have very high thrust ratings. So their range is limited, but within their range, they're potentially devastating, because the ability to outpace and outturn something is very important, especially at close quarters. So yes, I guess the answer would be yes. You could do stuff like you did in Wing Commander. You could do escort missions, or you could do, attack the enemy transport mission or whatever. I think it's 100% possible. I've just never done it myself, but.
Yeah, it definitely, the ship exists in Classic Traveler. I would call it the ship's boat, and I know that because of its massive 6G acceleration capability, thrust 6.
I don't know if they come with a weapon though. The ship's boat.
It does a crew of 2. This is essentially a space fighter. It can mount a single beam or pulse laser, and then additionally missile racks and sand casters. So this is to me seems like a space fighter. But
the ship's boat then turned into something else in later editions. That's for sure. It does not come stock with a weapon.
Yeah, and so 2 things come to mind with that about space combat. I love the idea. To me, I've always, and even when I was like, okay, I want to run Traveler, I want to see this, I was like, I have to see space combat. To me, I couldn't have even been interested in the game if it didn't put that through its paces. To me, that seemed like almost one of the most essential things. I could play D&D in space, but I can't. But D&D doesn't have an answer for, whether it's Wing Commander or whatever, the Battle of Wolf 359 or whatever it's called. It can't. D&D can't do that. So I wanted to see it. Well, anyways, my observation has been that it is one of the least popular aspects of Traveler. Like, there are tons of referees out there that are like, I just wouldn't do that. One of the reasons is because for Traveler, it's lethal. You could just get vaporized. And it seems to be that way in both current edition and in Classic Traveler. It's certainly true in Classic Traveler, but it's not like you have it's not like in Star Wars where you have a Mon Calamari cruiser that has like a shield value and you've got shields up, or like in Star Trek where you've got shields and then shields go away and you've got hull, and then and you can kind of trade licks back and forth, generally speaking.
It depends. Yeah, it depends on a lot of factors.
Sure, but at least
a salvo of missiles could absolutely destroy just about any ship. Any non-capital ship is vulnerable, very vulnerable to good shots. They have to be good shots, and there's not like a super high chance of getting killed really quick. I mean, depending on if you have armor. Much like, I would compare, at least in Mongoose, which is what I have way more experience in doing. 'Cause, I have done space combat. I just haven't involved a lot of small craft in it and done the fighter thing much. But just like as much as Classic Traveler depends on armor for range combat, Mongoose Traveler absolutely depends on ship armor. Like, you can get armor on your ship if you can afford it that almost negates most weapons.
Nice.
Barring extremely good shots, which are low percentage, or you could have the cut rate armor, which mitigates the damage and has a higher chance of damaging vital systems. And you damage the wrong vital system, you could really be out of luck. So that certainly remains true, but it's not the kind of thing where I'd be totally terrified of getting into combat if I had a ship with guns.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So, and this is an area where maybe people can tear me up in the comments, and because I'm a fairly new Traveler referee. We've been doing Classic Traveler how long? 4 months, 5 months now. And I had only ran Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition 2 or 3 times before that as one-shots, and then I'd played in Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition a few times, but never very long games. So here we are, we're playing Classic Traveler now, and this is my perspective, being a nut about space combat, is the first thing I saw with Mongoose was, from my point of view, it made the most sense to think of it in terms of a radar. As if you were on in a fighter craft in modern times and you had a radar screen. That's how I would orient the ship. If you change the orientation of the ship, what I would change for the players is the position of any other ships or objects on the radar.
Yeah.
Now that's just me. And then it had kind of bands that were, to me, decision points. Like, if you get it to a certain range, whether it's your weapons range or what have you. And then Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition seems to work more like a modern science fiction space combat simulator. And what I mean by that is your thrust. You have kind of an immediate, and you can get into a furball where if you apply too much thrust, you're going to have to go around and go the other way. So, like, you can end up overshooting a target or end up in a worse position, and you have to anticipate that and decide when you're going to change your vector and how much thrust you're going to add. And that's sort of maybe like a modern space combat simulator with Newtonian physics, where you're going to slide because you've got all that thrust, that you have to adjust. In Classic Traveler, my observation, I still prefer the radar method, but what they provide in the book, for what it's worth, is a large war game with a surface scale of 1 to 100 million, with 1 millimeter equaling 100 kilometers. And they propose that you should tack on little strings to represent vectors for ships, and a ship will kind of slide along its vector with its thrust rating, and this turns into kind of like submarine warfare, where depending on where you are and where you can detect ships, whoever
yeah.
can detect someone first.
That
Now,
sounds. I was
go
just going to say. I mean, I ran radar. You're talking about military equipping you for skills. That was my job in the Army. Was air defense artillery radar, and that's exactly how they display. That's exactly how aircraft display. You've got, you've got the vector indicator, and the length of it indicates the relative speed, and you've got an identifier on each target that is the best identification that the entire air defense picture can provide. Which, if you're just a solo spaceship, depending on this quality of your sensors, might be widely variable. A lot of that in Mongoose Traveler is they get real deep into the sensors, the kinds of things that sensors can do. Classic Traveler is much simpler in the sensor department, which is fine. But
I prefer, and this is what I do in our game, is I prefer to stick to that radar model, because what I found is Classic Traveler is even simpler if you run it from like the book like we do without adding stuff, in that the only thing that matters are those range bands, because at a certain range this will happen, and at this range this will happen. So there's a range at which a military ship or a scout will detect you. There's a range that you'll get a penalty for a fire. But to me, what Classic Traveler feels like in space, this is just I think of two things in science fiction. It does not feel like Star Wars. Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition feels more like Star Wars. It feels more like a space combat simulator. And I say that it also has rules for a furball, for a dogfight. If you're within a certain distance of each other, then all of a sudden it depends on who has a certain thrust rating, and it simulates a furball, where who can get behind who and fire the most. Classic Traveler doesn't have that. Classic Traveler reminds me of old science fiction novels where it would describe where people were in relation to whole celestial bodies, and as soon as a sci-fi ship detected another one, it could attack it. And that's the really horrifying thing in Classic Traveler is laser fire, where
I do feel entitled to say Mongoose has that too.
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying. Is
Yeah.
It's really scary to me. It feels really scary, which I love.
And that's why I've never dealt with dogfights, is because every engagement in any game that I've played was over before we got to dogfight range. It was either over because somebody had better thrust and was able to skedaddle, or because somebody fired a good salvo of missiles and it was just over.
Yeah, and the other thing, other than old sci-fi novels, that reminds me of is The Expanse, where like those are the things that you're thinking about. If you can detect the other ship first, you might have them if you're armed, or vice versa. They may have you. And it's a little bit like submarine warfare, and a little bit something else too. I guess it's yeah. And then time passes, and I think this is true in Mongoose too, right? But in Classic Traveler, time passes. It does. I don't know if the time is the same, but it does 1,000 second rounds in Classic Traveler. So 6 minutes and change will pass, and when you all were making decisions in space combat, I would tell you that. I would say, all right, now about 15 minutes passes, and then this happens,
right,
and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there's the spaceship combat is a 6-minute turn, and there's things that happen within that turn that are in Mongoose are actually kind of similar to the way FTL works. It's if anyone's played that video game. I don't know.
I love FTL. Yeah. So I didn't know if you meant the new game that's coming out by Stoligama.
I assume there's also similarities there, but I could be wrong. But in that, there are positions that the crew occupies that have specific types of actions they can take during that 6-minute turn, and the captain or whoever's in the leadership position can sort of assist, in motivation and give like tangible bonuses, that are clearly defined in in or somewhat clearly defined in the core book.
Yeah, that's great, because then you end up having that feeling of either Star Trek, where you've got like the Millennium Falcon, and maybe you've got two people that are running around trying to put out a fire, which could happen, right? Like you can have something get hit, and then you have to deal with it. Meanwhile, you have different stations, and they're trying to communicate, and that just sounds fun.
And you've got an engineer whose job it is,
like
to run
fire,
around.
yeah, like Firefly, yeah, or
And-
like Star Trek, yeah.
Yeah, so it's and you've got, and then there's of course the possibility of boarding actions and all of that kind of thing.
Oh man, sandcasters and boarding actions, yeah. So many things.
Yeah, so we were talking about what the elements are, and space combat is sorry. So when we were talking before, I said that I was talking about these different armor types, and I'm realizing now. Did you ever play Mongoose 1?
No.
Okay, so the first Traveler game I ran was first edition Mongoose, and all the ship creation rules are in the core book of first edition. They are not in the core book for second edition. So it makes sense to me that if you were looking at what was there, like there's very few ships that start with crystal iron armor, for example.
Yeah, I never heard of it.
Yeah, and so like that's part of the first crew that I had, the one that rolled this admiral and everything. They rolled a large number of ship shares, and they rolled the admiral rolled a ship's boat as one of his retirement things. Benefits, and so they constructed their own Jump 3 capable Fat Trader with like complete with guns, like raised turrets and crystal iron armor. So they were essentially able to masquerade as a merchant vessel, and they were a merchant vessel, but they also had a good amount of their internal space dedicated to being able to completely kick ass if they had to.
Nice.
But because of that, my earlier experiences with space combat were essentially, I made the mistake in my first Traveler game that I made in my first Shadowrun game, which is, in my very first Shadowrun game, I gave a troll character a Panther assault cannon. because I was 14 years old looking at a rule book and looking at the strength score of the troll, and I was like, well, he could carry it. Not really realizing that that's the equivalent of handing somebody like a +4 weapon or something in D&D and saying, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I kind of did that with my party and immediately jumped into the higher ranges of what's possible with Traveler, and I never really got to see that hard Scrabble life in my first edition game that I ran.
Well, it sounds fun. Well, we got a lot of stuff to crack open.
Let's move on.
We're out of time for tonight, but I say next time let's just keep peeling back. I want to talk about gizmos. I mean, you can't talk about science fiction without talking about gizmos and gear and doodads, and what does that all look like? I mean, do you loot things in this game, or do you so let's talk about that next time.
And we got to talk about the actual traveling, because we got to talk about
traveling, right?
Because I want to violently agree with you once again about a couple things. I think it's very possible to run a successful business with and mitigate risk in Traveler if you want to, but that's all for a discussion for another. Sometimes it's not possible.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not, but it's an achievable goal. Gosh darn it! And if the player doesn't believe it, at least the character should, or else it sort of becomes you lose all hope. But anyway, we can address that.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to talk about it. But thanks a lot, Father Chris, for
my pleasure
chatting with me tonight.
Thank you.
Mythic Mountains RPG is a private online play club that focuses on folk RPGs. Folk RPGs are the games that belong to all of us. They're what actually happens at a table between friends. It's their voice that has the authority on what is fun and what works for them. Weekly, we upload our games to allow others to sit in with us. The channel isn't monetized. We don't own the artwork, music, software, or games shown in these actual plays, and you can find links to their authors in the description. Like, subscribe, and share if you wish, or don't. Just like games in person, you're welcome to pull up a chair, sit in, and watch some of our games. No performances, no fancy equipment, just regular people playing folk pencil and paper role-playing games and having a good time. We hope these games will prove a source of enjoyment to anyone just wanting to listen in, anyone looking for examples of how actual groups run and play folk RPGs, and most importantly, if you haven't found your group yet, you're welcome here at ours.